Welcome to the Private Practice Startup, where we inspire you from startup to mastery. We chat with entrepreneurs, experts in the mental health and business arenas, and successful private practitioners to give you the tools needed to make your dream practice a reality. Visit theprivatepracticestartup.com for awesome resources, free trainings, and so much more. Here are your hosts, Dr. Kate Campbell and Katie Lemieux.
What's up, Startup Nation? We are back again with another episode of the Private Practice Startup Podcast. I'm Dr. Kate Campbell, and I'm here with my amazing co-host.
Hey, everybody, it's Katie Lemieux.
Yes, and we are recording from sunny South Florida with Tim Hollowell, who is all the way in Washington State, so all the way across the country. And we are really excited to have him here today. But before we introduce him, we just wanted to let you guys know we had such an amazing show last week with Melvin Verghese from Selling the Couch. And he talked about using a podcast to grow your practice. So if you haven't already heard that podcast, you will make sure you want to go back and listen, because today's is going to be all about podcasting as well. We have Tim, who's going to be talking about the 5 tips for building your private practice through podcasting. And Tim is a really special guest. By the way, welcome, Tim.
Hey, thanks you guys so much for having me. Appreciate it.
We're really excited to have you here. Tim is usually in the backgrounds because he is actually our amazing podcast editor. And he takes care of all of the post-production for our podcast, which is a huge resource. I can't tell you how grateful we are to have him. He does an amazing job. So for today, we've got tons of practice building and podcast building value bombs and ninja tips. So make sure to listen. But for first-time listeners, we just wanted to take a moment to say thank you guys for listening. And we have a special gift for you. Make sure you head over to our website at theprivatepracticestartup.com. Go over to our resources tab, and there you will see our A to Z cheat sheet, the essentials for building your private practice. And then also for anybody who's returning, if you guys haven't already joined our Private Practice Startup Facebook group, make sure you connect with us there. We've got an amazing community of private practitioners across the globe and professionals who want to help you build and grow your dream private practice.
Yes, so welcome, Tim. Like Kate said, we are super excited to have you. And just to remind you that Tim is talking about the 5 tips for building your private practice through podcasting. And we like to share a little bit about our guests before we get started. So Tim started podcasting in 2014 while working at a radio station in, I'm going to have fun saying this, Walla Walla, Washington. It's just so much fun to say. But currently he lives in Spokane, Washington with his amazing wife, Bethany, and they're expecting their first child in September of this year. So congratulations, Tim. That's super exciting.
Thank you. Yes, we're very excited.
We're excited for you. And we're really excited to have you today. So, Tim, what led you into the business you are now?
Yeah. So as you mentioned in my bio, I was in radio, and my wife was in nursing school at the time. And I had always kind of wanted to go into business for myself, but I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. So I started podcasting. We started this podcast called Wallaholics, which is all about the town of Walla Walla, Washington. And so we did that for about a year. And while I was at the radio station actually ended up picking us up. So we'd have a once-a-week show, which was really cool. And like I said, I always wanted to do something for myself. And my wife graduated from college and got a job in nursing, which allowed me to take a little bit of a risk. And I loved podcasting. I had been doing my own post-production work for quite some time by that point. So I thought, why not just help other people do it? So that's how it all got started.
That's awesome. I love the name to your show, Wallaholics. So what would you say is the best advice that you've ever received that relates to building a business and becoming an entrepreneur in podcasting?
Somebody once told me, I think it was a Chamber of Commerce president in Walla Walla. His name is David Wilson. And he said something to the effect that, while you're building a monster, make sure you're building a machine as well. And that applies to business, of course. So it's great to have a bunch of clients and a bunch of business and revenue and everything that comes along with that. But if you do not have a system, you are going to be eaten by that monster very quickly. At least that's the way I took it. And that served me very well.
Tim, you're a man after my own heart. That's one of my favorite words, systems.
It is.
Yeah.
I'm always assuring that we had the system in place. And that's one of the best things I think I've learned from business coaching is, as you're creating your business, just like you said, is really creating the systems around it. And really think about, even when you start, like, what is your assistant going to be doing and who's going to take over this task? I think that's so essential to be able to build and grow a business. Unfortunately, Kate and I love the E-Myth, and the E-Myth talks about, the technician, the manager, and the entrepreneur. And many people, unfortunately, get caught in the technician place if they're not thinking about systems and how to outsource their own selves. So that is really awesome, great advice, and one that I'm definitely always preaching. So I'm excited to hear you say that.
No, and the E-Myth, I've heard you guys talk about it before. And in fact, I read it recently because of your podcast, and I can't say enough about it. It was a fantastic book. It's not going to be the book I recommend everybody, but it was a very good one, worth reading.
Oh, that's awesome. We're glad you took something of value away from our podcast as well, because you listened to 1 million of them, right?
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right.
And it's interesting because I know the book and the resource that you are going to actually talk about later, we just did a photo shoot 2 weeks ago. And interestingly enough, in the room, we went to this really cool space. And I'm like, where's some props? And on the shelf, there was the book that you're going to recommend later. I was like, let's throw it in the picture. So as we get our pictures up, you'll actually see that book in one of our pictures.
So let's go ahead and jump into your topic, the 5 tips for building your private practice through podcasting. So Tim, what is tip number 1?
All right. So tip number 1 is to invest in an external microphone. So when you're podcasting, there's no doubt about it that content is king. If you don't have interesting, compelling content, to your audience, you are not going to get very many listens, and you are not going to be able to grow. However, sound quality is also very important. Now, it's not important that you have NPR quality audio, but it is important that you have what I call listenable audio. And almost any external microphone is going to be better than the built-in microphone that is on your laptop or desktop. So very important to invest in an external microphone. And if you'd like to know which one, you can visit my website, and we'll talk about all the resources that I have on my website, I'm sure later on in this episode.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. We invested in the AT2020, which is the mic that we use now. We started out with a Snowball mic, and that worked pretty well, but then it kind of wasn't working so well, and we got this mic. We really love it, but I'm sure our listeners will really want to take a look at your resources and your website, so we'll make sure to include all of the links and resources that you talk about within our show notes.
Absolutely. And I guess there is a part 2 of that advice. When you are recording with your guests, if at all possible, it's nice if they have an external microphone as well. And even a microphone that's built into headphones will generally be much better than a microphone that is built in to their laptop or desktop.
Yeah, we've had to actually re-record a couple of podcast interviews that we've done with people that the sound quality didn't come out as well as we had hoped, or they were in a busy location. And so we've made sure that anybody that we have on the podcast, that they have an external mic. And, we really want to make sure it's the best quality for listeners as possible. So that's really good advice.
Yeah, like I said, content is definitely king, but you don't want to have it so that people have to really listen hard to just tell what's being said. And then the other part of that, I guess, that I should mention is sponsors. If you ever want to monetize your podcast with sponsors, of course, they're going to be wanting to attach their name to a high quality podcast. And part of that is having good audio.
Absolutely.
So share with us tip number 2.
Tip number 2 is to develop a format and stick with it. And so this has to do with the format of your podcast. You guys have a format that works incredibly well. And I recommend that everybody find a format that works and try to stick with it as much as possible. Now, when you're first starting to podcast, it's okay if this does change quite a bit over the first month or two. Because especially if this is your very first podcast, it's all new to you. And so that's okay if it changes quite a bit. However, after the 3, 4, or 5 month mark, you should be in a pretty good rhythm and be able to set up a format that is going to work in the long run. Because it is important to set up something where people know generally what to expect. And of course, that goes with the length of the podcast as well. I've had clients that have had podcasts that only last 5 minutes, and the next week they have an hour and a half. And I really haven't seen them have too much success with that, just because it's so inconsistent from week to week as far as format and as far as the length of the show goes. And I've worked with people that have been very successful with very short podcasts, as short as 5-10 minutes. And I've also worked with people that had very successful podcasts that are well over an hour. But by and large, what I've seen work is somewhere around that 25 to 30 minute mark. That seems to be the sweet spot for podcast episodes.
Nice. Yeah, that's really what we found out in our research as well, is that people listen till about, most often the 22 to 25 mark. And so we try and keep it within that time frame as well. And actually, a few years ago, I was turned on to the world of podcasting. My husband, Brent, he was telling me about this podcast he was listening to. This is probably like 2.5, 3 years ago, something like that, called Entrepreneur on Fire. And John Lee Dumas is amazing. He's got an incredible podcast out there, and he interviews a different entrepreneur 7 days a week. So it's a ton of work for him. I'm sure he doesn't do it. Somebody else does it for him, but he's got really significant value on that podcast. And I was so inspired by it. And I remember after my son was just born, walking him around the neighborhood in the stroller and listening to Entrepreneur on Fire and being like, oh, so inspired. We've got to do something like this. So our framework for our podcast was actually inspired by John Lee Dumas's framework and what he does, which is really cool.
And actually, that's what you did, is you listened to the podcast about podcasting while walking around, and that's exactly what.
I watched his webinars and online courses on podcasting and what he recommended, and did a bunch of research on that, and it really inspired our framework. So it's really cool to hear that feedback from you, Tim, that we're on the right track.
Yeah, you can't go wrong listening to John. I've checked out a lot of his resources, and of course, I direct people to my website to learn about podcasting. But he has a lot of great resources as well on the topic of podcasting. I recommend that everybody check out his site. It's fantastic.
So share with us tip number 3.
All right. Number 3 is be authentic.
Did you say be authentic? You get the cowbell. How exciting. That's one of my favorite words here at the Private Practice Startup.
I was looking forward to this one. Yeah. So, the wonderful thing about podcasting is that it allows you to create almost a personal relationship with your listeners, because, you're in their headphones and they're listening to only you. And it's a wonderful thing. However, you are not going to be able to grow that podcast significantly, in my opinion, if you are not being yourself, if you're not authentic on your podcast. So, and that means if you're not a big rah-rah, always positive person, that's okay. Of course, you need to bring energy, you need to bring passion, you need to bring great content. But that does not mean you need to be this rah-rah, always positive person that never has a bad day. Because I think in the long run, it's not going to be that much fun for you to do the podcast, and people can tell that you're faking it. So yeah, above all else, be authentic.
Well, I'm glad you say that, because I am actually feeling a little tired today. And I was sitting here before you even said that thinking like, I wonder what the audience is thinking, because Katie's not talking that much and she's not as energized. So I appreciate you saying that. I'm just going to be authentic and tell you guys just where I'm at today. So that's just where I'm at.
That's great. That's great.
So thanks for the permission. Being authentic is truly important. And as we've actually grown into the private practice as well as our own practices, Kate and I have just kind of been more and more authentic, and it's really quite liberating. When you're just in alignment with yourself, people are attracted to that. They're attracted to that because you're credible, because you're human, because you're likable, because you're just like everyone else. So, showing your faults and failures and imperfections. I know we're always talking about our mistakes. I just posted something in our Facebook group last week about my very first professional photo. If you're in the group, you probably have seen it. And so I laugh at myself because I wasn't sure if I was selling a house or litigating a case. Yeah, I looked at this black jacket with this, white button down, and I have my arms crossed like I'm all professional. That is totally not me. Well, it is me, but not me. But obviously things have changed. And if you've seen any of our updated photo shoots from the Private Practice Startup, it's really cool. We have pictures in front of graffiti walls and on the beach. And that's just kind of really truly who we are. So authenticity is so important.
This is an aspect that therapists really need to step into to be, to feel comfortable with being who they are, because coming out of grad school, they're taught to be really professional and have very strong personal and professional boundaries and not self-disclose. And so when you're really learning to become more comfortable with sharing your story and using that as a way to connect with people and just being real, being you, being authentic, being imperfect and being okay with that, it really is so freeing and very important in the podcast realm.
Absolutely. And I think that it's normal for you to be very nervous, right? When you first get in front of a microphone. I remember when I first got in front of a microphone, I could barely put 2 words together, much less a half an hour of content, because I was just so nervous. It was just different to me than, being in front of a telephone or something like that. And so because of that, I definitely wasn't as authentic as I would like to be. But as you record more content, as you get a little bit more comfortable, you will be more authentic.
Yeah, that's definitely how I was in the beginning of trying to do video recordings. On the podcast, I feel like, okay, people can't see me, so I'm safer here. I don't know, there's some sort of false sense of security, although you guys can hear everything. But when I'm in front of video, and when I used to be in front of video, I would be so rigid and so not authentic. And I'd be like memorizing what I wanted to say, and it would come out like so forced and fake and just
it
structured.
Was like moving the Tin Man. It was like,
yeah, seriously. Yeah, it was pretty bad. But the more I've done it, the more I've gotten a lot more comfortable in front of video and all of that. I still get nervous sometimes, but yeah, podcasting, something about not having people see me. I'm like, okay, they can't see me. I can't see them. It's okay. It's all good.
No, and I think that podcasting, if you are maybe a little bit of an introvert or if that kind of thing stresses you out, then I think that podcasting is a great way to start because you're right. People can't see you, and you can always go back and, edit out your flubs and keep on going.
Yeah, It's easier than being live. Very true. Yeah, the editing component is that also like a safety net. Yeah.
And as you guys are talking, I'm just having this visual, like when you're podcasting, you're having usually this pretty intimate, connected conversation between 2 or 3 people, and like other people get to be privy to that. Like that's kind of cool.
It's really cool.
It
can be quite powerful.
Yeah. So lead us on to number 4.
All right. So number 4 is release episodes frequently and consistently. So the most successful clients that I've seen tend to release at least once per week. But most important is to release at the same time each week, because it's very important that your audience knows when you're going to be releasing new content. And if you do it like a lot of people do, where they have maybe 3 episodes in 4 days and then wait 3 weeks to put out anything else, that is not going to be good because people will check back maybe a couple times and then pretty soon they're going to give up on you. And they might give up on you for good. So if you want to build a consistent audience and really grow your podcast, it's important to be as consistent as possible and also release as much as possible. Now, I understand there's time constraints. Some people can't do a once-a-week podcast. That's fine. Then just do maybe once every other week. I haven't seen a whole lot of success with once a month releases from my clients, but I'm sure it does work for some people.
Yeah, we started out we were posting a podcast every other week or releasing one every other week. And then we just had so much fun with it. We were loving it and getting such good feedback from our listenership that we decided to launch one every week. And eventually we'll probably go more than that because we just love the podcasting so much. But for now it's once a week, and that seems to be working pretty well, especially when you have somebody like yourself, Tim, who's helping with the post-production side of it, because that is super time consuming. It was for me anyways.
Yeah. And we'll probably get into that a little bit later, but most people expect to spend, I think it's 3 minutes in post-production for every 1 minute of recording. And it's not that way for everybody. Some people just, run it through an automated tool and publish it right away, and that's fine. But for a lot of people, you do have to keep that in mind. Post-production is a very time-consuming process, so it's okay if you can only release once a week or once every other week. But yeah, be consistent about it.
I'm laughing at myself right now because when I tried to edit one of the podcasts, it literally took me about 4 hours. The first time I tried to do that in Audacity, which is the program that we use on our side to be able to, we used to use that to record and stuff like that. But I went through and I was removing the so's and the ums and every little imperfection. And oh gosh, it took forever. That was the one and only time I did it though.
So before we move on to the last and final tip, one thing when you talk about posting or releasing episodes frequently and consistently, Kate and I a few weeks ago had done a Facebook Live of the behind the scenes of what it looks like to create a podcast. And we've actually created a 20-step system in regards to finding a guest, to actually publishing and making everything live. And so when we post, it's not only posted on our website, but it goes out in a newsletter. It's get blasted on social media. It goes on YouTube. So there's many places that it posts, and consistency is so important for that, because you're right, Tim, you'll lose your listeners if you're not consistent with that. So that's really essential. So before we do get to number 5, I just want to review. So your first tip was invest in an external microphone, develop a format and stick with it, be authentic, release your episodes frequently and consistently. And what would you say is number 5?
So number 5 is it's kind of what you already just alluded to, which is promote your podcast. And this is a very big one. I've seen a lot of people that spend countless hours, setting up their podcast, booking guests, recording content, either paying me for the post-production process or doing it themselves. And then they just sit back and then hope that listeners will find them somehow and their podcast will grow. And the truth is that it used to be much easier to grow a podcast than it is today, but there is a whole lot more competition. So if you want to be able to grow your podcast and really reach a lot of people, it's important that you do actively promote your podcast on a consistent basis. And I do have a few tips for doing that. There's a lot of different ways to doing it, but I do have a few tips that I recommend everybody start with. So the first one is what you already alluded to, which is posting to social media. And this is very easy to do using the media host Libsyn. There's a service called Libsyn OnPublish, and that allows you to automatically post to your social media feeds every time you publish an episode from Libsyn, which makes it incredibly efficient, and it's very important that you do that. The second thing is to ask your guests to share their interview, share their episode on their social media accounts. Now, I realize that not every single podcast is an interview format, but a lot of them are. And so if you're interviewing people, it's great to have a systemized way to ask them to go ahead and share that podcast episode. If you just ask them at the end of the podcast, hey, when this publishes, would you mind sharing it? There's probably a 1% chance they're going to share it, or maybe a little bit higher, but not a whole lot. However, if you have an email all ready to go with the link that they need to share when that episode publishes, you have a much better chance of them sharing the episode. And you have to remember that podcasts are in a specific niche, and there's a good chance that the friends of those people that you interviewed would be very interested in the topic that you are discussing on a week-to-week basis on your podcast. So that is a great way to grow your audience. And then next, if it's possible, it's great to go on to other podcasts that are, either in your niche or related to your niche, because people that listen to one podcast usually listen to more than just one. So that is always a great opportunity. Anytime that you can be interviewed on another podcast or get any other kind of media exposure, that's always a great opportunity, and you can grow your podcast listenership significantly by doing that. And then lastly is just to ask your listeners to share the podcast on their social media accounts. Some of my clients only ask maybe one every 4 episodes. Others ask every single episode. That's really entirely up to you what you feel comfortable doing, but I do think it's important that you do it at least occasionally.
So as you're talking, I'm thinking to ask you certain questions, and I think you answered all the questions I have, and it really confirmed that our system is pretty solid. One extra thing that we do, which is a #ninja tip, is that we actually send the embed code to our guests so that they can also put it on their website, which allows them kind of instant credibility talking on something that they're most passionate about, which helps their own audience identify them. But at the same time, our podcast is now on their website, which is really cool. And if they're interested in what we've done, they'll connect with us as well. So that's just one other little added thing that we've thrown in there. So Tim, these are awesome. We were so really delighted to have you on the show today. What do you want to make sure our listeners get out of your message today?
I think that the message that I want to share with everybody is that if you have a message, then you have the ability to share it. It used to be even 10, 12, 15 years ago, it was much harder to share a message than it is today. There was a very high barrier to entry. If you had something to say, you had to be employed by a radio station or TV or newspaper or something like that. But nowadays, if you have a message, there's no reason that you can't share it. And podcasting is a wonderful way to do that.
And I can't tell you how many times Kate and I are part of another group called Healthcasters. And so it's wellness professionals that do podcasting. And so many people talk about how they get clients from their podcast. So I know we're talking about like the nitty gritty of podcasting, but literally you can get clients as a private practitioner from podcasting because they have a chance to get to know you, like you said before, kind of personally, if you will, quote unquote, without really having that direct contact with you. And you really build your relationship through there. So I know we were talking about the book, so I was alluding to that. So what is the book that you would recommend?
Yeah, so I have read a lot of different business books, and there's a bunch of great ones out there, so it's very difficult to pick just one. But since you asked for just one, the one that I recommend is The One Thing by Gary Keller.
Yeah, great book. And then you also have a giveaway for our audience. What is that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go to my website, which is thepodcastingguy.com, if you enter in the code STARTUP upon checkout, you can get 25% off your first purchase. So that can apply to either post-production of an episode or what I call a jumpstart package, which is helping you start your podcast. So 25% off, just enter in the promo code STARTUP, and that's all one word.
Great, Tim, you've been such a pleasure. And I know that we have just really loved working with you. You've been easy to work with and such a help. And you're just always so responsive. So if you are a private practitioner or anyone else listening to this podcast who's thinking about podcasting, leave the editing to Tim.
Yes.
That's really the best advice that we can give you because you'll spend more time doing the things that you love, gathering your guests, thinking of new topics. Tim is excellent at what he does. So Startup Nation, we had a great time on today's podcast. Tim was awesome and amazing. We wanted to thank you for tuning in. And for next week's podcast episode, actually, we are going to have ourselves on the episode. We're doing a two-parter of all the Practice Ninja tips, tricks, and hacks. So you'll definitely want to make sure that you tune in for that. Make sure you check out the show notes page for all the tips, resources, giveaways, and links from today's show. Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review, and share with your friends, family, fellow colleagues, your pets, whoever will listen. We hope you have an amazing day, and we look forward to continuing you from startup to mastery.
See you later, Startup Nation. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks for joining us on The Private Practice Startup. Visit theprivatepracticestartup.com for awesome resources, free trainings, attorney-approved private practice paperwork, and so much more.